what's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. A few episodes back, I talked about the end of the Jefferson administration and how he, Madison, and a few other Republicans concocted the Embargo Act of 1807 to try to get Great Britain to stop impressment of American sailors. I ran through the buildup of American commerce in the Atlantic and gave y'all some background about just how much the so-called carrying trade benefited the United States from 1795 to 1805. But then Jefferson didn't renew the Jay Treaty and refused to accept neither British restrictions on American trade nor anything less than a complete halt to impressment altogether, and thus the British-American relationship began to deteriorate. Eventually, the embargo was deemed a failure, and it was overturned in favor of the hilariously named Non-Intercourse Act of 1809, just as Jefferson was leaving office and Madison was taking office. In this episode, I will talk about James Madison as president, how hostilities ramped up again with Native Americans in the West, and how the United States eventually ended up declaring war against Great Britain in 1812. But before I do all that, I'd like to ask y'all again to please like, subscribe, spread the word. If you have not already subscribed, it really helps the channel out, helps other people find it, helps it get up there in the search algorithm or whatever the hell. And the more people that find the show and subscribe to it, the more likely it is I'll get to keep doing what I'm doing. So if you're enjoying what I have done so far, the best way you can help is to like, subscribe, and let other people know about the show. Tell your family, tell your friends, anybody you think might be interested, coworkers, if you're a student, other students, whatever. Everybody's welcome, and I think that anybody who comes to this can probably learn something from it. At any rate, as always, I'm going to let y'all know what are the resources that I used to write out this episode, as well as give you a big question to consider that I think will help you to better understand and process the information and, probably remember it a bit longer than you otherwise might. So, first off, with the resources, a lot of them are the same. I'm still referring to Give Me Liberty, the common AP US History textbook, also the American Pageant, another common AP US History textbook. I'm still using Empire of Liberty in the Oxford History of the United States series that covers this period by Gordon S. Wood. I've incorporated a couple new resources that particularly cover James Madison's presidency as well as the War of 1812. The first of those is The Presidency of James Madison by Robert Allen Rutland. And the second is The War of 1812. That's the title of the book, written by Donald R. Hickey. Those are books that I used a lot while I was planning out these episodes because they both provided a great amount of detail, and I found them both to be very helpful. So as far as the question is concerned that I think you should think about as I'm going through this information, here it is. What sort of challenges did James Madison face as he became the fourth president of the United States? How was he personally, well or poorly, suited to the job? And what factors led to the United States declaring war on Great Britain in the summer of 1812? I'll say that one more time. What sort of challenges did James Madison face as he became the fourth president of the United States? How was he personally well or poorly suited to the job? And what factors led to the United States declaring war on Great Britain in the summer of 1812? So think about that as I'm going through this information. I think it will help you to get more out of it. So let's go ahead and get into it. James Madison was a brilliant political theorist and political philosopher, and he was vital to the creation of the American Republic as it currently stands. He's called the father of the Constitution for a reason, and he was instrumental in shaping the federal government from his position in Congress in the first years of the Washington administration as well. He was in the House of Representatives, and he was a vital conduit of information and helped to provide structure both to the executive branch and to the legislative branch, Congress, that he was a part of. But Madison was not a charismatic, inspiring leader of men in the same way that Thomas Jefferson was, and certainly not like George Washington or Alexander Hamilton or even John Adams in Adams's own kind of curmudgeonly way. All of those guys did inspire other people to follow them. Madison just didn't have those qualities, those characteristics. He was more of a brain, of a thinker, of a writer than a political leader, you would say. Madison was quiet and diminutive and had trouble asserting himself in company. He became president almost strictly because he was so very close with Thomas Jefferson and had served as Secretary of State during the entirety of Jefferson's presidency. Madison's presidency was something of a fait accompli, and that probably hurt Madison more than it helped him because he didn't have to try to win anyone over as he was making his case to be president. He didn't have to try to appeal to his peers or to his competitors even. And apart from a somewhat muted minority in Congress, he was assumed the heir apparent among Democratic Republicans as they were putting their heads together to figure out who was going to be president in 1808. He, Madison, had been the staunchest advocate in Jefferson's cabinet of the so-called restrictive regime, attempting to force Britain and France to respect the free trade rights of American vessels through any means other than war. Non-importation, non-export, and most dramatically, the Embargo Act of 1807. Those are all considered parts of what is generally referred to as the restrictive regime that sought to impose commercial penalties on those countries that were not respecting American shipping and American sailors in the period 1805 to 1807. That's when the measures were first put into place. Madison vigorously defended the embargo and was the last to accede to its failure in the Jefferson cabinet anyway. He still believed that his duty as president was to avoid war and make Britain in particular, but the world in general, respect the United States sovereignty. He was almost as paranoid about Britain and the pro-British character of the Federalist Party as Jefferson had been. As he took office, the Non-Intercourse Act, insert joke here, was replacing the embargo, and Madison was just as determined as Jefferson and any other Republican to reject impressment, demand the neutral rights of American merchants to trade when and where and how they pleased, and to avoid even the appearance of kowtowing to Britain or to France. The challenges the Madison administration faced were not limited to foreign policy, resulting from the ongoing war between Britain and France and how this impacted American trading rights. Though it was the biggest issue, by far I would say, there were others facing Madison during his first term. There was a great deal, for instance, of factionalism in the Democratic-Republican Party at the time that Madison became president. John Randolph of Virginia had become a vocal opponent of the Jefferson administration, often criticizing it for not going far enough in the direction of policies that adhered to Republican dogma, like, for example, totally eliminating the national military and relying on militias exclusively for America's defense, or for completely killing the Bank of the United States. Randolph's Old Republicans, or tertium quids, which was a Latin phrase they often used to refer to themselves, along with almost all the Federalists and 3 of the Invisibles in the Senate, Samuel Smith of Maryland, Michael Lieb of Pennsylvania, and especially William Branch Giles, also of Virginia, routinely worked to undermine Madison and push out his most important cabinet member, Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin. And these guys all had different interests, whether you're talking about Giles and Smith and Lieb in the Senate, or whether you're talking about the Federalists in both the Senate and the House, or if you're talking about a guy like Randolph, who was an arch-conservative and wanted to see the most kind of extreme version of republicanism be instituted while he was in the House and Madison was in the White House. They all had kind of different motives. The Federalists had been opposed to everything Jefferson did and just wanted to see the regime and what it stood for pushed away. And they definitely wanted to do things more their way than the way that Jefferson and the Republicans had done things ever since Jefferson became president. Anyway, this factionalism within the party was representative of the larger factionalism in the country as a whole. Madison came into office concerned about the solidarity of the Union as he was taking over. There was, for instance, a great deal of animosity in New England and New York toward the Jefferson administration's policies, in particular the Embargo Act, which in New York and in all of New England they hated. And you could understand why, because it was brutal to commerce and to trade, was the Embargo Act. It virtually shut down all trade and commerce, with the exception of those ways in which people in that part of the country just said, fuck it, and got around it however they could. But officially, the Embargo Act, shut down trade altogether, which was horrific for the economy of the Northeast. In addition to that, the opposition between North and South that would eventually lead to the Civil War in the 1860s was really starting to crystallize during Madison's presidency. Northern states had outlawed slavery and were pursuing more commercial and manufacturing interests, while the South remained almost exclusively agrarian and was dominated politically and economically by the large plantation owners. I talked about this in the episode I did about why slavery not only did not die out in the early 1800s, but actually expanded. These influential Southerners, the wealthy planters, the planter aristocracy, whatever you want to call them, jealously guarded their state's powers against federal authority, particularly as it pertained to slavery, trade, and military powers. There was a yet unconsummated union between the United States and Florida as well that threatened disharmony and violence both internationally and domestically for Americans. Jefferson hadn't been able to purchase all of Florida from France or Spain, and Jefferson, claimed that West Florida, which is the panhandle area of Florida, not all of it, but some of it that is a part of Florida now, that portion of the territory west of the Perdido River, I think I'm saying that right, the Perdido River, that's West Florida. It's in the panhandle. It's west of the Perdido River. Jefferson claimed that that portion of Florida had been a part of the Louisiana Purchase. Madison inherited this claim, and Americans who wanted the United States to annex all of Florida, but West Florida at the least, had already undertaken occupation and military action of their own to claim it. Madison finally decided that the risks of an international incident were worth the result, and he issued a proclamation on October 27th of 1810 that West Florida was, in fact, part of the Louisiana Purchase. Federalists, as you might imagine, called this an abuse of executive authority, and the British complained, but no serious opposition to American occupation emerged. And many Americans in the surrounding area were relieved that they could now combat smugglers, Native Americans who were a threat to them from that part of Florida, and that they could try to reclaim escaped slaves in what was now officially a United States possession. Where Madison was relatively bold on Florida, his timidity cost him in relation to the Bank of the United States, which he had lately decided was advantageous to the country despite his earlier quite significant opposition. The bank was due for a recharter in 1811, and both Madison and Secretary Albert Gallatin of the Treasury Department wanted the bank renewed. But Madison didn't really attempt to convince Congress to renew the bank, unlike Gallatin, who pleaded to anyone who would listen for the Bank of the U.S. to be rechartered. Mostly, Madison didn't do this because he wanted to spare himself the embarrassment of supporting an institution that he had earlier claimed was unconstitutional. As a result, Congress narrowly voted to reject the recharter of the bank, and this metastasized into a major problem when financing the War of 1812 became so difficult, mostly because Republicans were adamant about not raising taxes, but also because Federalists waged a campaign to undermine the purchase of government securities meant to fund a war, the War of 1812, that they opposed. So basically, without the Bank of the United States, it made paying for the war much, much more difficult because Republicans didn't want to raise taxes, and Federalists in the Northeast, many of whom had a lot of capital and who would have been the most likely candidates to buy a bunch of government securities, what we in the more modern era might call war bonds, they were like, fuck that. We're not doing that to help support this war that we don't like. Sell our war bonds elsewhere. Good luck with that. From Madison's point of view, his most sacred task as president was to avoid war with Britain or France. Jefferson had kind of danced right up to the line of war with Great Britain, especially after the Chesapeake Leopard affair. But both Madison and Jefferson believed, as did the vast majority of Republicans in the Congress and in the state legislatures and wherever else they were, in the early 1800s, they all believed that war was incredibly dangerous for Republican government. Both Jefferson and Madison fully endorsed the notion that war gave far too much power to central governments and provided the conditions, specifically accruing debt, increasing military capabilities, and enhancing executive authority that would most easily undermine Democratic or Republican or Democratic and Republican institutions. Preserving these institutions and not having the U.S. devolve into a European-style monarchy was both Madison and Jefferson's utmost priority, and the same could be said for the Republican Party, the Democratic Republican Party writ large. Consequently, Madison and the Democratic Republican Congress continued to pursue policies that attempted to assert American sovereignty while also trying to avoid open war with Britain or France. But getting these great European powers to respect American shipping rights, free trade in general, and the civil rights of American sailors without violent reinforcement proved to be damn near impossible. The, again, hilariously named Non-Intercourse Act, which was ratified the day the embargo was rescinded, the Embargo Act was rescinded, closed off commerce, in this case only with Britain and France, rather than with the entire world, as the Embargo Act had done. It also did, the Non-Intercourse Act, offered the carrot of reopening trade to both Britain and France if either or both would end its restrictions on American shipping. It appeared that there might be a breakthrough just after Madison took office, as he engaged in negotiations with the British foreign minister in America, a guy named David Erskine, I want to say. It's either Erskine or Erskine, who had received word from the British Foreign Secretary, George Canning, that Britain would be willing to cancel the Orders in Council, which were Britain's version of trade restrictions, if the United States would allow the Royal Navy to enforce American laws on American ships that might try to trade with France and not just Britain. So the British are saying, we'll back off on the Orders in Council if you Americans, if you, the American government, let us, the British Navy, make sure that American ships are not trading with people that we don't want the United States to trade with. So that's kind of Great Britain acting as sort of a policeman for American policy. Madison naturally objected to the Royal Navy enforcing American laws, but he and Erskine both kind of said and heard what they wanted to say and hear, and Madison prematurely announced an end to trade restrictions with Britain on April 19th, 1809, not very long after he had taken office. He probably only been in office for like 6 weeks at this point. And when the nature of the agreement that he and Erskine had struck got back to Canning, again, the British Foreign Secretary, he, Canning, rejected any cancellation of the Orders in Council without Britain being able to inspect American ships. From Canning's point of view, from the British government's point of view, Erskine had basically just kind of skipped over the part that was really important, that the Royal Navy ships could inspect American ships, and just said, whatever, we'll revoke our Orders in Council, you guys can keep trading wherever, yada, 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 and everything will work out great. But the yada, yada, yada part turned out to be pretty important in this case. And the contest between American assertion of sovereignty and British attempt to keep Napoleon from being able to wage war all over Europe continued. This whole affair ultimately resulted in a long period of diplomatic silence, or close to it, between the United States and Britain, as both sides recalled their ministers in the wake of this embarrassing miscommunication and did not solidly re-establish diplomatic relations almost until the war had been declared. They did it a little before there were ministers. For a while in Britain, there was just an American charge d'affaires rather than a true minister that had diplomatic connections directly to the White House. And so that hurt communications in a way that might have prevented war had they been better. Anyway, the lack of diplomatic ties is one of the things that worsened the relationship between the two sides and created conditions for an American declaration of war, ultimately in the summer of 1812. Republicans in Congress, led by Randolph from Virginia, fought against Madison's push to prepare the nation for a potential war in 1810. There had been preparations for war in 1806-07 when Jefferson was president, when the Chesapeake Leopard affair happened, when British impressment was really starting to ramp up, and a lot of Republicans were sort of feeling like, hey, look, we did this shit already. We sank money into this, and we really don't want to sink any more money into it until we know that we're going to have to deal with this issue, on top of the fact that, again, from their point of view, the Republicans in Congress do not want a large centralized military force under the control of the federal government. They want to stick with militias and privateers because a large standing army or navy, in their view, was dangerous, something that very many people in the United States are still really nervous about. The Madison administration, proposed some pretty modest spending increases to enlarge the army and pay for some more naval vessels, but these were voted down in Congress because this Congress was allergic to increasing taxes or to, as I said, increasing the stature of the military because they were, frankly, a little paranoid about it. Madison's efforts at military preparedness were further hamstrung by his inability to form a competent officer corps, staffed only by soldiers who earned their position through merit. Many of the officers in the Army leading up to 1812 were there as political appointments or holdovers from the Revolutionary days, and most were either old and infirm or completely lacking in the leadership qualities required for their positions. The incompetence and the nepotism that led to the incompetence in the officer corps was one of the single biggest issues during the War of 1812, and it's why, probably more than any other single reason, the war went so badly for the United States in 1812 into 1813. The officer corps just sucked. Meantime, Congress had rescinded the Non-Intercourse Act in favor of a bill that almost everyone hated, but that somehow still became law. Macon's Bill No. 2. The bill temporarily lifted for 3 months, specifically, all trade restrictions with every country and stated that if either Britain or France would drop their interference with American shipping, the United States would cease trading with the other unless the other stopped messing with American shipping as well. As historian Fred L. Engelman wrote in his book, The Peace of Christmas Eve, the rationale supporting Macon's Bill No. 2 seemed to be quite absurd. Quote, "It was assumed that if one nation so allowed itself to be blackmailed, the other would soon be compelled to follow suit." I think that's a pretty great quotation from a historian. So things really didn't get better, and there is this very gradual drift to war that happens that, from what I've read, seemed utterly preventable had things been run a little bit differently in the White House and in Congress. Napoleon, as was his Machiavellian style, saw Macon's Bill No. 2 as an opportunity to put the clamps to Britain and drive a wedge between the United States and its former colonizer. In August of 1810, the French emperor and his foreign minister, the Duc de Cador, I have no idea if I'm saying that correctly, they deliver a letter to the American minister in France that promised France would rescind its trade restrictions if the United States promised punitive action against any nation keeping its own trade restrictions in place. That's clearly targeted at Britain and Britain's Orders in Council. The Cador Letter, as it came to be called, was meant clearly to lure the American government into greater conflict with Napoleon's mortal enemy, Great Britain. It was particularly cost-free to France because Britain, as a result of the Royal Navy's victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, had virtually uncontested dominance over the seas. Another great quotation. This is from the Presidency of James Madison, the book I mentioned earlier, and the resources that I used to write the episode. Quote, "To say that Madison jumped the gun is too mild. The president threw away all caution and issued a proclamation accepting Napoleon's claims at face value." Unquote. Madison's November 2nd proclamation stated that if the British government didn't rescind its Orders in Council, another non-importation law would cut off trade between the United States and Britain beginning in February of 1811. This is all based on Madison taking the Cador Letter at face value. Napoleon's government released a few American ships for the sake of appearance, but it also continued to seize American ships well after Madison indicated his hope to accept the proposal in the Cador Letter. Congress passed a new Importation Act in February of 1811 that prohibited British goods and ships from entering the United States, while permitting American ships and goods to be exported to Britain. So we're not going to accept British goods or ships into the country, but we're still going to allow American ships and goods to go to Britain, if they're cool with that. In June of 1811, the new British minister to the United States arrived and subtly threatened the Madison administration with retaliation if the Non-Importation Act were not suspended. He also insisted that France had not, in fact, lifted its decrees against trade, and that the British would not do so either until His Majesty's government had definitive proof that France had actually forsaken its trade restrictions. Also in 1811, an exchange of fire between a British ship, the Little Belt, and a larger American frigate, the President, resulted in the deaths of 9 British sailors and 23 British sailors wounded. The Battle of Tippecanoe between English-supported Native Americans in the old Northwestern Territory and American soldiers led by William Henry Harrison served to further inflame tensions between Britain and the United States. So lots of stuff is causing things to get worse between the United States and Great Britain in 1811. As animosity ramped up with Britain over these various issues, and with the impressment of American sailors and the disrespect it implied for American sovereignty continuing with no end in sight, one of the elements that contributed to the more pugnacious position of Congress in 1811 was a new faction of younger members of the House of Representatives from the South and the West known as war hawks. Congress generally had a high turnover rate in the early days of the Republic. And that was mostly because having a job in Congress as a member of the House or a member of the Senate wasn't as prestigious or as lucrative or as cool as it is now. Washington was not really a city. It was kind of almost an outpost with not a lot to offer in terms of culture or food or any of the stuff that we consider it having nowadays, and a lot of members of Congress just didn't have a great desire to stay there for a long period of time. And in the so-called War Congress that met for the first time in 1811, there were about 70 freshman lawmakers taking up their positions in the Capitol for the first time. Many of these were of the bellicose war hawks. The war hawks included John Calhoun of South Carolina, Richard M. Johnson of Kentucky, Felix Grundy of Tennessee, George M. Troup of Georgia, and Langdon Cheves and William Lowndes, also of South Carolina. But the most important and clearly most talented of the crew was Henry Clay of Kentucky, who became Speaker of the House at only 34 and who cleverly maneuvered to put key members of this caucus, the War Hawks, in important committees, which, by the way, Congress splitting up into committees is a brand new thing at this point. It had not been going on for a long time, but eventually, as Congress continued to operate and as people who'd been there for a while started to clock its maneuvers and think about how it might better work, these committees start to emerge in the early 1800s. And Henry Clay was very skillful in managing those committees by putting people in them that shared his ideology. And these war hawks on these committees kept Congress moving in a belligerent direction. The Foreign Relations Committee, one of the most important still, which was dominated by war hawks, forwarded and got the full Congress to adopt resolutions that beefed up the federal army, despite objections from some people in Congress, and the state militias, which I think kind of softened the blow for people who didn't want to vote for increasing the size of the U.S. Army. They also provided funds for further arming existing naval vessels, for fitting them out, was the expression, and they allowed for merchant ships to arm themselves, and these resolutions were passed between December of 1811 and April of 1812. There were also much more contentious debates over increasing the size of the Navy, and Congress ultimately declined to augment the number of warships in 1811-1812, and over raising taxes to pay for greater ground forces and other defense increases such as gun batteries in harbors and that kind of thing. But Congress ultimately did proceed with the tax increases despite Republicans' deep suspicion of giving more funds to the federal government and their fear of blowback from their constituents. Now, these taxes didn't really kick in until war had been declared, so it wasn't like the taxes were going to go up right then to help fund the creation of the Army and of the Navy. I mean, the Navy, they basically just said, fuck it, we're not going to do that. But this is a big part of the reason also why the war went so badly in 1812, 1813. The Army was tiny, and Congress just didn't put the necessary measures in place to make it a force that would actually be able to carry out the things that Congress wanted the military to do. Congress then enacted a 90-day embargo in April that was understood as a prelude to war for the stated purpose of protecting American ships and keeping potential war supplies available in the United States. Again, the lack of diplomatic communication between the two countries made each confused about the other's intentions as this all went on. I read a number of messages from British diplomats in the United States writing to their superiors back in London. I don't know what the hell's going on here. I'm not sure what to make of what the Americans are doing. And this is a great example of just poor communication that pushed each of the countries eventually to go to war with each other. Britain actually did not want war in 1812. It was enmeshed and had been for over 20 years in this titanic struggle with France, and they certainly didn't want to open up any more fronts of warfare anywhere else because their forces and their money were stretched pretty thin as it was at this time. So Britain did not want war with the United States and began to make conciliatory gestures toward the U.S. in late 1811. They settled the Leopard Affair, which had been lingering since it happened in 1807, I want to say, by disavowing the attack and by paying reparations to the United States and to the sailors who had been injured or killed, their families if they had been killed in the incident. In May of 1812, the British offered to equally split a share of licenses with the U.S. to legally trade with the European continent, which essentially amounted to suspending the hated Orders in Council. The British, though they had these Orders in Council, these trade restrictions in place, there was still trade going on between Britain and the continent, Europe. And they were willing to give some of these licenses to the United States to try to smooth things over, but Americans at this point, when the British are making these gestures, both, number one, didn't think it was adequate to the complaints that they had, and number two, they didn't really trust the British to follow through on this. There was just this, as I've said many times in this episode and in previous episodes, this kind of like paranoia against Great Britain. So Madison, of course, rejected this proposal of the shared licenses as it demanded that American merchants conduct trade under British rules. But then on June 16th of 1812, the British Foreign Secretary announced to Parliament that the Orders in Council would be suspended if the United States ended its boycott of British imports. A week after this, Britain announced that it would end the whole system of licenses and blockades altogether. It's the vast majority of what Americans wanted, minus the impressment issue, which was still a big deal. But it's a pretty big concession from the British point of view, especially given what their position had been in the years leading up to this. But by the time Britain is ready to make this concession, actually does make this concession, it was too late. On June 1st, Madison sent a message to Congress, basically, though not explicitly, recommending a declaration of war, and on June 17th, the Senate approved a House bill that had already declared war on Britain. Thus, on June 18th, 1812, the United States was at war with Great Britain once again. And this is mostly, again, from the American point of view about proving American sovereignty. That we, the United States, are not some third-rate post-colonial power that y'all in Europe can just pick on anytime you feel like it. That's, I think, more than anything what the war was about. So, that's the show for today. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thanks very much for watching, as always. If you would like to give me some feedback, make some suggestions for the show, just tell me what you're thinking. Feel free to reach out to me at howthehelldowegetherepod@gmail.com. You can also shoot me a voicemail or a text message at area code 951-525-5536. Thanks again for watching, take care, and I will catch y'all next time.